The rain was pouring hard that night in downtown Seattle. Water dripped from the broken awning of Joe's corner store, where a young man in a worn-out hoodie paced back and forth, checking his phone every few seconds. His hands were shaking, but not from the cold. This was his usual spot. The store owner pretended not to notice him, just like everyone else did. He'd been dealing drugs here for almost 2 years now, caught in a cycle he couldn't break. The money was quick, and the customers were steady. Plus, he needed his own fix more than he liked to admit. The blue and red lights caught him by surprise. He'd always been careful, always watched for cops, but somehow this one snuck up on him. His heart jumped into his throat as he shoved the small plastic bags deeper into his pocket. But it was too late. The officer had already spotted him. "Evening," the cop said, stepping out of his patrol car. He wasn't what you'd expect. No tough guy act, no hand on his holster. Just a calm voice and tired eyes that had seen too much. "Officer Ray," that's what his nameplate read. "I'm not doing anything," the young man mumbled, knowing how hollow those words sounded. His fingers traced the edge of the plastic bags in his pocket. One quick move and he could toss them, but something in Officer Ray's expression made him hesitate. "Why don't we talk for a bit?" Officer Ray gestured toward his patrol car. "It's pouring out here, and I could use some company on my break." There was something different about his tone. No judgment, no threat. Just conversation. Inside the patrol car, the heat was on full blast, and the radio crackled quietly with dispatcher calls. The young man sat stiffly in the passenger seat, expecting handcuffs any second. Instead, Officer Ray pulled out 2 coffee cups from a holder and offered him one. "I've been watching this corner for a while now," Officer Ray said, blowing steam from his coffee. "See a lot of people come and go, but you're different. You've got something in your eyes, like you're not really meant for this life." The young man stared into his coffee cup, watching the ripples form as his hands trembled slightly. "What do you know about my life?" He shut back, but his voice cracked halfway through. "I know you're smart enough to pick the busiest corner in the neighborhood. Smart enough to never carry more than you can swallow if you need to. Smart enough to be something better than this." The words hit hard. Nobody had talked to him like this in years, not since his grandmother passed away. That's when everything started falling apart. School, jobs, relationships. They all slipped away one by one until the streets were all he had left. "Look," Officer Ray continued, pulling out his phone. He showed a photo of a young kid, maybe 14, grinning in a graduation gown. "This was my nephew. Was dealing on a corner just like this one. Did last year." He paused, his voice getting quieter. "I see him in you. Same smart eyes, same way of carrying yourself. He never got his second chance, but you still can." The young man felt something warm on his cheek and quickly wiped it away. He hadn't cried in front of anyone since he was a kid. But here he was, sitting in a cop car, tears mixing with the remnants of rain on his face. "I've got to take you in," Officer Ray finally said. "You know that, right? But this doesn't have to be the end of your story. Could be the beginning of something new." As the handcuffs clicked into place, they felt different than he'd imagined. Not like chains dragging him down, but like a wake-up call. Officer Ray didn't rush him to the car, didn't rough him up like other cops might have. Instead, he kept talking about programs in jail, about education opportunities, about people who could help. That night changed everything, not because of the arrest. He'd been arrested before. But because for the first time in years, someone saw him as more than just another dealer on a corner. Someone saw him as a person who'd lost his way, but could still find his path back. As the patrol car pulled away from Joe's corner store, the rain started to let up. Through the window, he watched his old spot disappear into the darkness. He didn't know it then, but that corner would become just a memory, a reminder of where he'd been, but not where he was going. The county jail wasn't anything like the movies. No tough guys starting fights, no dramatic showdowns in the yard. Just endless gray walls and the constant tick of time moving too slowly. But for him, those 18 months became something unexpected, a chance to breathe, to think, to remember who he used to be. Officer Ray's words kept echoing in his head during those first few weeks. "You're not meant for this life." At first he tried to brush them off, told himself the cop was just talking. But in the quiet of his cell, when the night stretched long and sleep wouldn't come, those words wouldn't leave him alone. One morning, he noticed a flyer for GED classes posted on the common room wall. He'd dropped out of school in 10th grade, back when everything started falling apart. His cellmate caught him staring at it. "Waste of time," the older man said, not looking up from his magazine. "We're all going back to the same life anyway." But something inside him disagreed. Maybe it was Officer Ray's voice in his head, or maybe it was remembering his grandmother's face when he told her he was quitting school. Either way, the next day, he put his name on the sign-up sheet. The classes weren't easy. Years of street life had made him forget basic math, and his writing was rusty. But the teacher, Mr. P, didn't give up on him. "You've got a good mind," Mr. P would say, staying after class to help him with algebra. "Just needs some dusting off." Then came the Narcotics Anonymous meetings. He didn't want to go at first, didn't think he needed them. But after one particularly rough night, when the cravings hit so hard he couldn't sleep, he decided to give it a try. The stories he heard there shocked him. A former business owner who lost everything to pills. A college athlete whose injury led to addiction. A grandfather who missed watching his grandkids grow up because of heroin. These weren't the junkie stereotypes he expected. They were regular people who'd lost their way, just like him. "Recovery isn't about being perfect," his group leader would say. "It's about being honest with yourself." Those words hit home. For the first time, he started being honest about how it all started, the pain of losing his grandmother, the loneliness, the gradual slide into dealing and using. The months began to pass differently. Between classes, NA meetings, and the prison library, his days filled with purpose. He started writing letters to his little brother, trying to explain things, trying to be the big brother he should have been all along. One day, a counselor told him about a vocational training program he could join after release. "Construction," she said. "Good money, honest work. But it's not easy. You've got to stay clean, show up every day, prove yourself." He thought about Officer Ray again. "This doesn't have to be the end of your story," he'd said that rainy night. Looking at the program brochure, something clicked. Maybe this could be his new beginning. The last few months of his sentence, he threw himself into preparation. He earned his GED, scoring higher than anyone expected. He worked with the prison counselor to set up his post-release plan, halfway house, job training, and NA meetings. Every step planned, every detail considered. The night before his release, he couldn't sleep. Not from fear this time, but from something else. Hope, maybe. Or determination. The guy who'd been arrested that rainy night was gone. In his place was someone new, someone with a second chance. As he packed his few belongings, he found the coffee cup from that night with Officer Ray. He'd kept it, though he couldn't really explain why. Running his finger along its rim, he made a promise to himself. This time would be different. This time, he'd make it count. The morning of his release, the sun was just coming up as he walked through the gates. The world looked different somehow, brighter, full of possibilities he never noticed before. He had a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, he was ready to walk it. The county jail wasn't anything like the movies. No tough guys starting fights, no dramatic showdowns in the yard. Just endless gray walls and the constant tick of time moving too slowly. But for him, those 18 months became something unexpected, a chance to breathe, to think, to remember who he used to be. Officer Ray's words kept echoing in his head during those first few weeks. "You're not meant for this life." At first, he tried to brush them off, told himself the cop was just talking. But in the quiet of his cell, when the night stretched long and sleep wouldn't come, those words wouldn't leave him alone. One morning, he noticed a flyer for GED classes posted on the common room wall. He'd dropped out of school in 10th grade, back when everything started falling apart. His cellmate caught him staring at it. "Waste of time," the older man said, not looking up from his magazine. "We're all going back to the same life anyway." But something inside him disagreed. Maybe it was Officer Ray's voice in his head, or maybe it was remembering his grandmother's face when he told her he was quitting school. Either way, the next day, he put his name on the sign-up sheet. The classes weren't easy. Years of street life had made him forget basic math, and his writing was rusty. But the teacher, Mr. P, didn't give up on him. "You've got a good mind," Mr. P would say, staying after class to help him with algebra. "Just needs some dusting off." Then came the Narcotics Anonymous meetings. He didn't want to go at first, didn't think he needed them. But after one particularly rough night, when the cravings hit so hard he couldn't sleep, he decided to give it a try. The stories he heard there shocked him. A former business owner who lost everything to pills. A college athlete whose injury led to addiction. A grandfather who missed watching his grandkids grow up because of heroin. These weren't the junkie stereotypes he expected. They were regular people who'd lost their way, just like him. Recovery isn't about being perfect, his group leader would say. It's about being honest with yourself. Those words hit home. For the first time, he started being honest about how it all started, the pain of losing his grandmother, the loneliness, the gradual slide into dealing and using. The months began to pass differently. Between classes, NA meetings, and the prison library, his days filled with purpose. He started writing letters to his little brother, trying to explain things, trying to be the big brother he should have been all along. One day, a counselor told him about a vocational training program he could join after release. Construction, she said. Good money, honest work. But it's not easy. You've got to stay clean, show up every day, prove yourself. He thought about Officer Ray again. This doesn't have to be the end of your story, he'd said that rainy night. Looking at the program brochure, something clicked. Maybe this could be his new beginning. The last few months of his sentence, he threw himself into preparation. He earned his GED, scoring higher than anyone expected. He worked with the prison counselor to set up his post-release plan, halfway house, job training, NA meetings. Every step planned, every detail considered. The night before his release, he couldn't sleep. Not from fear this time, but from something else. Hope, maybe. Or determination. The guy who'd been arrested that rainy night was gone. In his place was someone new, someone with a second chance. As he packed his few belongings, he found the coffee cup from that night with Officer Ray. He'd kept it, though he couldn't really explain why. Running his finger along its rim, he made a promise to himself. This time would be different. This time he'd make it count. The morning of his release, the sun was just coming up as he walked through the gates. The world looked different somehow, brighter, full of possibilities he never noticed before. He had a long road ahead, but for the first time in years, he was ready to walk it. 5 years can change a lot, but some things stay exactly the same. The downtown streets still buzzed with the same energy, the same coffee shops still filled the air with their morning aroma, and the same hurried crowds still pushed past each other on their way to somewhere important. He stood on the steel beams of his latest project, a 15-story office building taking shape in the heart of the city. As site supervisor now, he spent his mornings checking progress, guiding his crew, and making sure everything ran smoothly. The view from up here was something else. He could see all the way to the water, and on clear days like this, even the mountains beyond. Taking a break, he leaned against a secured beam, sipping his morning coffee. His crew worked below, the steady rhythm of construction filling the air. 5 years of honest work had earned him this position, and he never took it for granted. Each morning, he still said a quiet thank you for this second chance at life. That's when he saw him. At first, he thought his eyes were playing tricks. After all, big cities have lots of cops walking their beats. But something about the way this one moved, the way he carried himself, it was too familiar to be coincidence. Officer Ray. He looked almost exactly the same, maybe a few more gray hairs at the temples, but still that same calm presence, that same watchful gaze. He was walking down the sidewalk across the street, stopping occasionally to chat with shop owners and morning commuters. His heart started racing just like it had that rainy night 5 years ago. But this time, it wasn't from fear. This was something else. Excitement, nervousness, gratitude all mixed together. 5 years of wanting to say thank you, of wondering if he ever get the chance, and now here it was. He quickly radioed down to his second-in-command. Taking 15, he said, already heading for the construction elevator. His hands were shaking slightly as he pressed the button, but not from withdrawal this time. These were the shakes of anticipation. The street-level noise hit him as he stepped out of the site. Traffic horns, construction sounds, city life in full swing. Officer Ray was still there, about half a block ahead now. For a moment he hesitated. What if the officer didn't remember him? What if he didn't want to be reminded of just another arrest from years ago? But then he remembered all those nights in jail, thinking about that conversation. All those moments when Officer Ray's words had kept him going, had helped him choose the right path when the wrong one looked so tempting. He owed this moment not just to Officer Ray, but to himself. He jogged across the street during a break in traffic, his steel-toed boots heavy on the pavement. His construction vest made him stand out in the morning crowd, and a few people turned to look as he moved quickly through them. "Officer Ray," he called out, his voice carrying over the street noise. The police officer turned, hand instinctively moving toward his hip, an old habit, probably. His eyes scanned quickly, professionally, taking in the construction vest, the hard hat, the work boots. There was no recognition yet, just the careful assessment of a veteran cop. "Can I help you?" Officer Ray asked, polite but cautious. He took a deep breath. "You probably don't remember me, but 5 years ago, on a rainy night near Joe's corner store." He watched as confusion turned to focus, and then, there it was, recognition dawned in Officer Ray's eyes. The officer's posture changed, relaxed, and a slow smile started to spread across his face. "The corner store," Officer Ray said softly, his eyes lighting up with memory. "We had coffee in my patrol car." "You kept the cup," they both said at the same time, and then laughed, the tension breaking like a wave. Standing there on that busy morning street, with the city moving around them and his construction site rising behind them, he realized something important. This wasn't just a chance meeting. This was the closing of one circle and the opening of another. This was the moment when a story of transformation could finally be told to the person who helped start it all. There's a small coffee shop on the corner where they ended up sitting, away from the morning rush. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. Here they were, sharing coffee again, but this time without handcuffs or patrol car seats between them. "I can't believe it's really you," Officer Ray said, stirring his coffee absently. "You look different." "Good different." 5 years clean, he replied, pulling out his sobriety chip from his pocket. He always carried it, a reminder of how far he'd come. But that's just the beginning of the story. He started telling Officer Ray everything, about those long nights in jail when his words kept echoing, about the GED classes, about the construction training. As he talked, he pulled out his phone, showing pictures of his projects, buildings he helped create, lives he'd helped change. "See that building there?" He pointed through the coffee shop window at the rising structure. "That's my current project. I'm the site supervisor now. 30 people under me, all learning the trade, all getting their own second chances." Officer Ray leaned forward, his coffee forgotten. "Tell me about them," he said softly. So he did. He told him about the kid who reminded him of himself, who now ran the crane on site. About the former gang member who discovered he had a gift for electrical work. About the single mom who started as a flight person and was now studying to be a project manager. But the real work, he continued, scrolling to pictures of the community center, happens after hours. The photos showed groups of teenagers, some looking tough, others looking lost, all gathered around workbenches and blueprints. "I run a program for at-risk kids, teaching them trade skills, sure, but really teaching them what you taught me, that they're worth more than their mistakes." Officer Ray was quiet for a long moment, just looking at the pictures. When he finally spoke, his voice was thick with emotion. "You know, in this job, we don't often get to see how things turn out. Most nights, it's just arrest after arrest, wondering if anything we do makes a difference." "That night made all the difference," he replied. "You could have just arrested me, done the paperwork, moved on. But you took the time to talk, to see me as a person, not just another dealer on a corner." He reached into his wallet and carefully pulled out a worn piece of paper. It was the coffee cup sleeve from that night, flattened and creased but still intact. "I kept this. Whenever things got tough, whenever I thought about giving up, I'd look at it and remember what you said about second chances." Officer Ray's eyes widened in recognition. "I remember that cup. Department coffee, terrible stuff." They both laughed, and somehow that laughter broke down the last walls between them. They weren't cop and ex-con anymore. They were just two men whose lives had intersected at exactly the right moment. "I've got something to show you too," Officer Ray said, pulling out his own phone. He opened a presentation titled Community Policing Success Stories. "I've been using your story, without names of course, in my training sessions with new officers, teaching them that sometimes the biggest impact comes from the smallest moments of connection." "You're kidding," he said, staring at the presentation. "Not at all. Your story, it changed how I police. Made me realize that every arrest is a crossroads. We can just process people through the system, or we can try to be that voice that helps them choose a different path. The morning light was streaming through the coffee shop windows now, catching the dust motes in golden beams. Outside, the city was fully awake, but in here, time seemed to stand still as two lives came full circle. I've always wondered, Officer Ray said finally, what made you listen that night? I'd had similar talks with others, but most just tune it out. He thought about it for a moment. You know, I think it was because you didn't talk down to me. You spoke to me like I was worth saving, and eventually I started to believe it myself. News travels fast in a city, especially when it's a story people need to hear. A construction site supervisor and a police officer, once on opposite sides of the law, now working together to change lives. It was the kind of story that gave people hope. Their first joint speaking engagement happened almost by accident. The community center was hosting a youth outreach event, and both men were invited separately. When they realized they'd be there on the same night, they decided to share the stage. The room was packed that evening. Teenagers slouched in chairs, parents standing along the walls, social workers and counselors scattered throughout. The tension was visible. Not everyone trusted cops, and some weren't sure about ex-cons either. But then they started telling their story. I was standing on that corner, he began, his voice steady, thinking I had it all figured out. Quick money, steady customers, no other options. But I was wrong about everything, especially that last part. Officer Ray picked up the thread. I almost drove past that corner that night. End of shift, paperwork waiting, but something made me stop. Call it instinct, call it fate, whatever it was, it changed two lives that night. The audience leaned in as they talked about that rainy night, the coffee cup, the conversation that sparked a transformation. But it wasn't just their story anymore, it was about everyone who'd ever needed a second chance, everyone who'd ever given one. The questions afterward came like a flood. Teenagers wanted to know about the construction training program. Parents asked about support services. Other police officers in the audience wanted to learn more about community engagement. That night sparked something bigger than either of them expected. The police department asked them to develop a training program together. Building bridges, they called it, teaching officers how to see beyond the arrest, showing them how small moments of compassion could change lives. The construction company got involved too. They started a formal apprenticeship program for people coming out of the system, giving them not just job training, but a real shot at a career. The waiting list grew longer every month. Other companies noticed. Soon, competing construction firms were starting their own programs. The city council took notice, allocating funds for more vocational training. What started as one conversation in a patrol car was becoming a movement. But the real magic happened in the small moments. Like when a tough kid from the streets would show up at the construction site, trying to act hard but eyes full of hope. Or when a rookie cop would stop to talk to someone instead of just making an arrest. They kept their day jobs. He still ran his construction sites. Officer Ray still walked his beat. But their evenings filled with speaking engagements, mentoring sessions, and planning meetings. They were building something bigger than buildings now. One night, after a particularly powerful session with a group of teenagers, a boy hung back to talk. He had that same look, the one that said he was trying to decide which path to take. "How do you know?" the kid asked. "How do you know when it's time to change?" He looked at Officer Ray, then back at the boy. "You know because someone believes in you before you believe in yourself. And once that happens, you can't go back to not believing." The kid nodded slowly, understanding in his eyes. Another life about to change course, another story about to begin. Later that night, as they sat in the same coffee shop where they'd reconnected, Officer Ray smiled. "You know what's funny? That night, I thought I was just doing my job. Turns out I was helping write a story that would change hundreds of lives. Including mine," he replied, raising his coffee cup in a small salute. "And we're not done yet." 1 year after their chance reunion, the downtown landscape had changed. The office building was complete, standing tall against the sky. But the real changes weren't in the skyline. They were in the streets below, in the lives being transformed one conversation at a time. The Building Bridges program had spread to 3 neighboring cities. Police departments were sending their officers to learn, construction companies were opening their doors to those needing second chances, and community centers were filling up with young people looking for a different path. On a crisp morning, they stood together on the roof of that completed building, looking out over the city they were helping reshape. Below them, a new crew was starting work on another project, many of them graduates from their program. "Remember that corner?" Officer Ray pointed to where it all began. The old store was still there, but the corner had changed. Instead of dealers, there was a small gathering space now, with benches and a community bulletin board advertising job training programs. "Hard to forget," he replied, thinking about how far he'd come. "You know what's funny? I used to think that corner was my only choice. Now I help other people see all the choices they have." Their weekly meetings at the coffee shop had become a local legend. People would stop by just to watch them talk. The cop and the construction boss, once separated by a badge, now united by a shared mission. They'd created a scholarship fund, helping people get the training they needed. It wasn't just construction anymore. They'd partnered with local businesses of all kinds, creating paths for people who needed them. The police academy had made their storied part of its standard training. New officers learned that sometimes the most powerful weapon they had wasn't their gun or badge, it was their ability to see potential in people who couldn't see it in themselves. But the real victory was in the small moments. Like when a former program graduate brought their kid to meet them, proud to show they'd broken the cycle. Or when a police officer would share how they'd had their own coffee cup moment with someone, starting another chain of transformation. That morning on the roof, they watched the sun rise over their city. A new crew was gathering below, ready to start their day of honest work. Among them were faces they'd both recognized, people they'd helped find their way back. "You ever wonder what would have happened if I hadn't stopped that night?" Officer Ray asked, his voice thoughtful. "Sometimes," he replied. "But I think the real question is how many other stories like ours are out there, just waiting to happen." They stood in comfortable silence, watching the city wake up. On the street below, a police car pulled up to the job site. But instead of tension, there were waves and smiles. The wall between law enforcement and the community was coming down, one brick at a time. "We've got a new group starting next week," he said, checking his phone. 20 people, all looking for their second chance. Officer Ray smiled. "Better stock up on coffee cups." They both laughed, remembering that first cup that changed everything. Now hundreds of cups had been shared. Hundreds of conversations had sparked change. Hundreds of lives had found new direction. As they headed down to start another day, they passed a wall of photos in the building's lobby. Faces of program graduates, success stories, lives rebuilt. At the center was a simple coffee cup mounted in a frame. Below it, a small plaque read, "Every transformation begins with a conversation. Every conversation can change a life." The story that began on a rainy corner wasn't ending. It was multiplying, spreading through the city like ripples in a pond. Each new person who found their way back became a guide for others. Each officer who took time to talk became a catalyst for change. And somewhere in the city that morning, another officer was stopping to talk to someone who needed to hear they were worth more than their mistakes. Another cup of coffee was being shared. Another story was beginning. Because that's how change happens, not all at once, but one conversation, one coffee cup, one second chance at a time.